Good evening. It's good to see all of you back this evening. We're going to finish up our study in the letter to the Colossians tonight. We're going to cover chapter 4. And just as a kind of an introduction, if you'll remember the letter to the Colossians, the overarching theme of this letter is Jesus is the preeminent one. Jesus is above all. And so in chapter 1, what Paul does is he establishes that fact. He describes Jesus, and he describes Jesus' preeminence in all things. And then in chapter 2, he moves on and shows how Jesus is the answer to all false religion and all human philosophy. And then what we looked at last time is in chapter 3, he talks about in light of these things, in light of who Jesus is, and that he is the answer, then it only makes sense that we should follow him. And so he gives direction about how to follow Jesus, how to follow the preeminent one. And that thought is really carried over into chapter 4, which is what we're going to look at tonight. We're going to continue that thought of how to follow Jesus, what following Jesus looks like. And again, just as a reminder, these are the key verses in this book that establish who Jesus is. In chapter 1 and verses 15 through 18, it says, "He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by him all things were created that are in heaven and that are on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things consist. He is the head of the body, the church, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in all things he might have the preeminence." And then Paul goes on in chapter 1, verse 28 to say, "Because of this, him we preach, warning every man and teaching every man in all wisdom, that we may present every man perfect in Christ Jesus." And then in Colossians chapter 2, Jesus is the answer, for in him dwells all the fullness of the Godhead bodily, and you are complete in him, who is the head of all principality. We don't need anything else. We don't need anybody else. We don't need any other religion. We don't need any other philosophy. We're complete in him. And so these are just the key verses. But then we're going to move on in, as I said, to chapter 4. And I had Jim read the tail end of chapter 3 because, as in so many of our chapters in these letters, it's kind of a bad chapter break because he ends chapter 3 talking about submission. And he continues that into verse 1 of chapter 4. But I think it's good that we go over this again because this is the foundation. This is the foundation of truly following after Christ is submission. If we don't learn to submit, if submission is not in our character, if it's not in our vernacular, if it's not in our vocabulary, we cannot follow Jesus properly if we don't learn how to submit. Taboo subject in 21st century America. I don't have to submit to anybody. I can do whatever. Nobody's going to tell me what to do, but if we want to be Christians in 21st century America, we better learn it, and we better apply it. And so he says there at the end of chapter 3, "Wives, submit to your husbands." And I put up, submission is not just for, we like to camp out on that. We like to camp out on, oh, wives, you need to submit, but that's not all he says. He also says, "Husbands, love your wives. Agape, love your wives," which will include some element of submitting to her and to her needs. "Children, obey your parents." That's submission. "Fathers, raise your children properly." Submit to your God-given role as the spiritual leader of your family. And then he concludes chapter 3 with servants. Submit to your masters. Not with eye service as men pleasers, but remembering that it's from Christ that you get your true reward. And then he moves on into chapter 4 and verse 1, which is where we'll pick up tonight. He says, Masters, give your bondservants what is fair, knowing that you also have a master in heaven. I really believe that what Paul is trying to show us is that there is no person on the face of this earth that does not have to submit to somebody in some way. And if we can grasp that, then we can learn what it truly means to submit to Christ. Because again, even the masters that, well, I don't answer to anybody. I tell my slaves what to do, and nobody else tells me what to do. But Paul says, masters, remember, you have a master in heaven. You answer to somebody. And part of what I think he's trying to get across here is that even Jesus submitted. Jesus, who was God, submitted. Brother Hugh brought up this morning during the Lord's Supper over in Matthew chapter 26, when Jesus was in the garden and he prayed. And in verse 39 it says, he went a little further and he fell on his face and prayed, saying, O my Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me, nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. Jesus submitted to the will of his Father. And this is not the only time, on the very last night of his life, of his earthly life, that we see Jesus submitting to the will of his Father. Go back to John chapter 4 and verse 34. Jesus said to his disciples, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and finish his work. My food is to submit to my Father's will. And one chapter over in chapter 5 and verse 30, Jesus said, I can of myself do nothing. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is righteous, because I do not seek my own will, but the will of the Father who sent me. Jesus was here to submit, and that led to the ultimate submission that Paul talks about over in Philippians chapter 2 and verse 8, where it says, and Jesus, being found in appearance as a man, humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross. So our truly following Jesus is founded on our submission. Our submission in the roles that God has given us, and ultimately our submission to Jesus and to his will and to his word. Do you know who the only person is in this world that doesn't have to submit to anybody? The Apostle Paul said over in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 27, he says, for he, that is the Father, has put all things under his, that is Jesus' feet. But when he says all things are put under him, it is evident that he who put all things under him is accepted. That is, he's the exception. When all things are made subject to him, then the Son himself will also be subject to him who put all things under him, that God may be all in all. The only person that doesn't have to submit to anybody is God the Father. He's the only one that had the power to give Jesus all authority, put all things under his feet in heaven and in earth, except himself. The rest of us have to learn to submit. And as I said, if we don't learn submission, we can't truly follow Jesus. Again, I'll go back to the example that Brother Hugh gave during the Lord's Supper this morning. Did Jesus only submit to the Father? What did he do on the night that he was betrayed? He got down on his knees like a servant and submitted himself to 24 nasty feet to wash those feet just like the lowliest servant would do. Jesus submitted himself to his brethren, to his disciples. That's what following Jesus looks like, that selflessness and that submission to the needs and to the will of others. And so then Paul goes on in chapter 3, talking, and we're going to look at some things that he points out here that I've kind of just termed following in every facet of our lives. He's going to pretty much hit every part of our lives and show how to follow Jesus. And again, I can't overstress this. Humility and submission is the foundation, because that is what all of these other things are going to be built on. So look with me, if you will, at chapter 4, verses 2 through 4. Paul says, "Continue earnestly in prayer, being vigilant in it with thanksgiving, meanwhile praying also for us, that God would open to us a door for the word to speak the mystery of Christ, for which I also am in chains, that I may make it manifest as I ought to speak." So another way that we follow Jesus is to engage in prayerfulness. And notice how he says that this needs to be done. He says, continue earnestly in prayer and being vigilant in it with thanksgiving. Okay? What does it mean to be vigilant in prayer? Well, it ties back to that idea of earnestness, of doing it earnestly, doing it consistently, doing it with regularity and consistency. But being vigilant in prayer also means that we are aware. We are aware of what's going on in our lives and what's going on in the lives of other people, and we are taking those things to God in prayer as well. You think about what Jesus did in John chapter 15. We're going to look at that here in just a minute. But who did Jesus pray for? He prayed for himself, but then he prayed for his disciples. And then he prayed for those who would believe based on the disciple. That's vigilance in prayer. That is being aware of what the needs are of others and our own needs as well, and taking them to God in prayer. That's what Jesus did. He was vigilant in his prayer. And it also requires thanksgiving. And again, I'm going to keep hammering on this. Doesn't it take humility and submissiveness to be thankful? If you're not humble, where do you think everything came from? Oh, that's me. That's all me. But if you're humble, you understand that you don't do it all by yourself. That what you have doesn't come from you. And that's the key to thankfulness, is that humility and that selflessness and that submission. And again, we see that with Jesus as well. And then also, Paul talks about, he says, be earnest in your prayer, be vigilant in prayer. In verse 3 he says, meanwhile praying also for us. So it requires praying for others. True Christ-like prayer is praying for others, and especially for those doing the Lord's work. And just a few minutes ago, I said John chapter 15, John chapter 17. where Jesus prays. But look in John chapter 17 and verse 20. Jesus says, I do not pray for these alone, the 12, but also for those who will believe in me through their word, that they may be one, as you, Father, are in me and I in you, that they also may be one in us, that the world may believe that you sent me. Jesus knew that the disciples were going to have a hard road ahead, that they were going to be working for him, and so he is praying for their work. And that's the same thing Paul is asking the Colossians for. Pray for my work, because that's what Jesus did. And you go over to Luke chapter 22, and I think Hugh mentioned this a couple of weeks ago too, but when Peter told Jesus, Lord, I will never forsake you, even if I have to die, Jesus said, Luke chapter 22, verse 31, Simon, Simon, indeed, Satan has asked for you that he may sift you as wheat, but I have prayed for you that your faith should not fail, and when you have returned to me, strengthen your brethren. Jesus didn't just pray for himself, but he prayed for the strength of others, and especially those who would be doing his work. And so, truly following after Jesus, truly following the preeminent one, has to include prayerfulness. But then he goes on in verse 5 of Colossians chapter 4 to talk about our conduct toward outsiders, and that just those who are not Christians. He says, walk in wisdom toward those who are outside, redeeming the time. Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one. And so he says, walk in wisdom toward those who are outside, redeeming the time. What Paul is telling us here is that we need to seize opportunities. We need to take opportunities to talk to people who don't know God when the opportunities arise, because we don't ever know if that opportunity will arise with that person again. And I couldn't think of a better example than over in John chapter 4, where Jesus meets the woman from Samaria at the well. Here was an outsider. Here was one who knew that the Messiah was coming, but didn't know Jesus. She didn't know about Jesus. And so Jesus takes this opportunity. And I'm going to tell you, brothers and sisters, this was not a convenient opportunity for Jesus. This was not a politically correct opportunity for Jesus, because in Jesus' day, a man by himself did not talk to a woman by herself, much less a Samaritan woman by herself. But Jesus took the opportunity to talk to her about salvation. And we need to do the same thing. And Paul goes on to say that when you do this, you need to speak with grace, having your speech seasoned with salt. What does it mean to speak with grace? Just speak with kindness. Speak with patience when you speak to people. And to be seasoned with salt, we all understand that we add salt to our food to make it taste better. Okay? So what he's saying here is that enhance the situation with what you say rather than making the situation distasteful. Season your speech with salt. Be kind. And know how to answer. This really just means think before you speak. And again, I'm gonna point to an example over in John chapter 8 of something that Jesus did. John chapter 8, beginning in verse 3, it said, the scribes and the Pharisees brought to Jesus a woman caught in adultery. And when they in adultery, in the very act, now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned. What do you say? This they said, testing him, that they might have something with which to accuse him. But Jesus stooped down and wrote on the ground with his finger, as though he did not hear. And they continued asking him, and he raised himself up and said to them, "He who is without sin among you, let him throw a stone at her first." And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground, and those who heard it, being convinced by their conscience, went out one by one, beginning with the oldest even to the last. And Jesus was left alone, the woman standing in the midst. And when Jesus has raised himself up, saw no one but the woman, he said to her, "Woman, where are those accusers of yours? Has no one condemned you?" And she said, "No one, Lord." And he said to her, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." You see what Jesus did here? First of all, he didn't speak when they first addressed him. He sat there. And I don't know if this is what Jesus was doing, but I know this is what I would have to do. I like to think Jesus was thinking about what he needed to say the proper words in this situation. That's what I would need to do. And notice what he said to her accusers. He wasn't hateful about it. He just said very simply, those of you who haven't sinned, you be the first. Because yes, she sinned, but you be the first. If you are completely sinless, you cast the first stone. Simple, wasn't hateful about it. And then when he was alone with the woman, he said, "Where are your accusers?" He said, "If they're not going to condemn you, neither do I." That is speaking with grace, seasoned with salt, and knowing how to answer to best address the situation. And that's what Paul tells us that we need to do as well in order to be like Jesus. And then the last section of this chapter. You know, a lot of times we go through this list of the different names that Paul talks about, and we kind of talk about them. But what I want to do to illustrate what we're talking about is I want to talk about them in their relationship with the church in Colossae. Because that's the point I believe that Paul is getting at here, is we need to know and we need to appreciate our brethren. And we also need to recognize, what their talents are, so to speak, or what they bring to the table and what we can offer them. Because as Brandon so often says, a lot of what Christianity is about is relationships. It's our relationships one with another. And as we enhance those relationships, our relationships with one another get better, and our relationship with God gets better. And that's exactly what Jesus did. I mean, is it any wonder that he was with those 12 men night and day for 3 years, building those relationships so that they could adequately do what they needed to do when he was no longer there? And so what Paul is doing here is he's showing them and he's showing us how to enhance our relationships with one another, with our brethren, wherever they may be. Okay? So notice, and we're not going to read probably every word of these last few verses, but in verse 7 he mentions Tychicus. He says he's a beloved brother, a faithful minister, and a fellow servant in the Lord. He'll tell you all the news about me, and I'm sending him to you for this very purpose, that he may know your circumstances and comfort your hearts. What I learned from Tychicus here is that just like Jesus, I need to allow myself to accept comfort from my brethren. and to give comfort to my brethren. Because Paul says, that's why I'm sending him to you. I'm sending him to you so he can bring news of you to comfort you about me. But that's a reciprocal relationship. They would need to offer comfort to him as well. But I think our biggest hang-up, honestly, is not giving comfort, it's accepting it. Because we don't want people to know we're weak. We don't want people to know we need anything. Remember, humility and submission. That's why this is we need to have that humility. We need to have that submission in order to accept comfort from one another, just like what Tychicus was bringing to the church. Did Jesus accept comfort from others? On the night that he was betrayed, after he had prayed 3 times, Father, let this cup pass from me, nevertheless not my will, but yours be done. In verse 43 it says, then an angel appeared to him from heaven, strengthening him or comforting him. If Jesus was not too proud to accept comfort, we shouldn't be too proud to accept comfort from our brethren. And then he mentions a man by the name of, who was coming with Tychicus by the name of Onesimus. Do you all remember who Onesimus was? He was the slave that escaped from Philemon. And Paul told Philemon, I want you to accept him back as a brother. And no doubt the church in Colossae knew Onesimus' story. And so what we learn from this is that we need to accept one another no matter what our socioeconomic status is. Onesimus was a slave. Who did Jesus choose as apostles? Did he choose the rich guys? Did he choose those who were at the pinnacle of society? Did he choose the bankers and the lawyers and the politicians? No. He chose the fishermen. He chose the tax collectors. Jesus accepted those who would come to him on his terms, no matter their socioeconomic status. And we need to accept others. If they are obedient to Jesus, we need to accept them, no matter who they are. And he refers to Aristarchus. In verse 10, and he calls him my fellow prisoner. So evidently Paul was in prison at this time, and evidently Aristarchus was right there. I don't know if they were in the same cell, but he was imprisoned as well. And so again, we need to remember, we have brethren in prison. Not just in other countries. We have brethren in prison that are in prison for being Christians in other countries, just like Paul was in prison for being a Christian. But we've also got brethren in prison right here in our nation because they committed crimes. And most of them learned the gospel once they got to prison and were converted, and they are working in prison to convert other people. I hope you all read Robert Rafe's reports when they come out, because he talks about our brethren that are doing the Lord's work in prison, and we need to remember them. Do you remember what Jesus said over in Matthew chapter 25, verses 35 and 36? He says, I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you took me in. I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me. And they said, Lord, when did we see you like this? And he said, inasmuch as you've done it to the least of these, my brethren, You've done it to me. That includes our brethren in prison. Jesus knows his brethren that are in prison, so we need to remember them as well. And then he mentions Mark. He says, Aristarchus greets you, with Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, about whom you received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him. Why would they not welcome him? Do you remember what Mark did? Paul wanted to go keep going on the missionary journey. And Mark said, "No, I'm going back. I'm going back to Jerusalem." And then when it came back time for another missionary journey, Paul and Barnabas were going to go together, and Barnabas said, "Let's take Mark." And Paul said, "I don't think so." Remember what Mark did? So they went their separate ways. Paul took Silas, Barnabas took Mark. But what this tells us is that whatever rift there was, Paul and Mark fixed it. And Paul is telling the church, don't you let that stand in. I'm not letting it stand in the way of my relationship with Mark. Don't you let it stand in the way either. Don't hold Mark's past circumstances against him. And that's what we learn here, is that we need to accept one another despite past circumstances. Think about how Jesus treated Peter. Peter denied Jesus 3 times. And yet, when Jesus rose from the dead, how did he treat Peter? He didn't let that past mistake define their relationship, but rather they moved forward together. And then he mentions Epaphras in verse 12. Epaphras, who is one of you, a bondservant of Christ, greets you, always laboring fervently for you in prayers, that you may stand perfect and complete in the will of God. For I bear him witness that he has a great zeal for you and those who are in Laodicea, those who are in Hierapolis. We need to appreciate those who are zealous for their brethren. Epaphras wanted nothing more than for the church in Colossae to succeed, to be perfect and complete in all the will of God, and he did everything that he could possibly do to make sure that happened. And we need to appreciate brethren like that. Over in John chapter 17, going back to Jesus' prayer for his 12, for his apostles. He says in prayer to God, he says, I've manifested your name to the men whom you have given me out of the world. They were yours, and you gave them to me, and they have kept your word. Now they have known that all things which you have given me are from you, for I have given to them the words which you have given me, and they have received them, and have known surely that I came forth from you, and they have believed that you sent me. You gave them to me. They have kept your word. They were zealous to do the work that God had set out for them to do, and Jesus remembered them. He prayed for them, and we need to be like Jesus. We need to do those same things. The rest of the last couple of verses there in chapter 4, not really just a whole lot to draw there, and so we're going to just draw it to a close here, just to wrap everything up, this study of the book of Colossians. And it's interesting to me in Colossians chapter 4, that what Paul does is he shows us Jesus without showing us Jesus. He shows us Jesus through the actions that are expected of Jesus' people. And that to me is just a beautiful thing, that God is able to do that. He's able to show us a picture of Jesus by showing Jesus through others, or showing Jesus through what's expected of others. It's through actions and a way of life that reflect Jesus. And so again, just to sum up, the letter of Colossians shows us, first of all, who Jesus is. He is the preeminent one. Secondly, it shows us what Jesus is. Jesus is the answer to all things. Because if Jesus is overall, then Jesus is the answer. And thirdly, this letter shows us, in light of who and what Jesus is, how we should respond to that. And that's by living like Him. And so we may have someone here tonight who, we talked about seizing opportunities. And we never let pass an opportunity when we gather if there is someone who has not obeyed the gospel of Jesus. Jesus is the answer. He is the Savior. He is the only one that can buy us back out of sin and bring us back into a relationship with God. And Jesus, because He is the answer, has told us what to do in order to get into that relationship. We have to believe in Him. We have to confess our faith in Him, repent of our sins, and be baptized in water, at which point God will take away our sins, and we can rise to walk a child of God, and we can begin to live like Jesus, the preeminent one, with a hope of spending an eternity with Him. And so we ask tonight, is there anyone here who needs to respond to that invitation? Or is there anyone here tonight who has issues, problems, things that we can pray for you about, pray with you about, or help in any other way, whatever your need may be tonight, to respond to the gospel call of Jesus? Let us know how we can help as we stand and sing this invitation song.